So this symposium would not have been possible without the absolutely tireless work of Donna Rack, who I'm hoping is still here. She's not. She's not here. Okay, well, we need to give Donna Rack a big round of applause. And also the very generous funding that we received from the All-Britain Center for the Study of Public Life, the American Studies Program, the Ethics and Society Project, and the Department of Anthropology. So, to our funders, thank you. And I'm Margot Weiss, to introduce myself. I'm an assistant professor of American Studies and Anthropology here at Wesleyan. And this is Naomi Glaser. She's an assistant professor of rhetoric and English at the University of Iowa, and we're co-organizing this symposium. Thank you. We've also known each other a little while. We're so excited to be here for this symposium on academia and activism, and I'm particularly delighted to be back on this campus. I actually graduated from Wesleyan a really, really long time ago. And in many ways, this place is perfectly suited for this event. After all, the Wesleyan website, as some of you may know, promises that, quote, this is a direct quote from the website, students learn to do productive and innovative work that makes a positive difference in the world. That's the dream, right? So, Margot and I began our planning. I'm serious. Margot and I began our planning for a special issue of a journal on this topic by contemplating various versions of this promise on the Wesleyan website. The promise that what happens in the classroom might liberate students and society. We've each been deeply compelled by that promise. I mean, we've devoted our careers to scholarly work on the political and historical and contemporary formations of activism, and our pedagogies and service commitments revolve around social justice and inspiring students to imagine new and possible futures for themselves and others. But we're also well-trained skeptics, and we regard these promises with suspicion at the same time. So after all, as Dylan Rodriguez argues in his work, and we're going to be hearing from him this afternoon, even the classroom shares a genealogy with the technology of the prison as a space. So even or especially if we teach concepts like American democracy or freedom, academic knowledge often reaps normalized and juridically valorized social violence. How many of us have sat in the classroom and wondered, this discussion of politics is all well and good, exciting even, but what is the point of sitting here? Like, do these ideas even matter? And I'm going to do a show of hands. How many people have actually had that thought in the classroom? I know. Yeah, right? So, and how many of us have become involved in activist projects and while working to prevent domestic violence or protest sex shopping or oppose draconian immigration laws have wondered, who is listening to me? Am I even making a difference? Can social institutions like the nation state or corporate capitalism or academia ever truly change? Show of hands? Is anyone wondering how to change? So we wanted to create an event where we could engage, on the one hand, our profound skepticism that knowledge can transform the world, but on the other hand, our romance with it. Perhaps we needn't choose between these. There is a power to the notion that activists can generate, work with, and transform academic knowledges, among others, and also to the notion that they need to be tied to the cumbersome life of the academy. And there's a power to tropes like, okay, I'm totally dating myself with this, but who here has seen Stand and Deliver? Is that a movie that keeps going even after 1980? So, Mr. Escalante is a trope. Like, there's something very powerful about that figure, but there's also something disturbing about him too, as if there is a calculus that can deliver us all. Or as if a single figure can bring about socio-structural change, or as if screening the transformation of underprivileged youth can actually transform the world. So today we have the privilege of hearing from 9 scholars from a range of disciplines. And together with the queer activist and self-proclaimed troublemaker Matilda at Bernstein-Sycamore and the feminist blog collective Feministing, we are collaborating on a special journal issue on exactly these questions. Politically engaged scholars have long encouraged us to investigate the university as a site of knowledge production and analyze the different methodologies and discourses of political engagement. However, contemporary conditions for both knowledge production and political engagement have changed. The successes and setbacks of the anti-globalization movement, new possibilities of online or transpolitical organizing, trends towards the corporatization or privatization of the university, and broader social and economic conditions,
neoliberalism, global capitalism, are just a few of the contemporary conditions that pressure activist and academic labor in linked yet disparate ways. Our symposium today reflects on these issues in two open roundtable discussions. The first, Intellectuals as Activists, Activists as Intellectuals, explores the often surprising ways in which academic work constitutes or contributes to activism, alongside the locational, institutional, and temporal obstacles that keep activism and academic work from meaningful dialogue or mutual intervention. The second, which is After Lunch, The Politics of the Neoliberal Academy, asks us to think through neoliberal demands for relevance and usefulness imposed by new configurations of knowledge and power, along with potential sites of resistance generated and sometimes reabsorbed under these new conditions of the academy. Together, these roundtables reflect a set of overarching themes or questions. What are the intersections and gaps between activist and academic work? How is activist labor intellectual, and when is intellectual labor activist? And how might we historicize dichotomies of theory and practice, ivory tower and real world? Those are scary. I should scare them. We assume that you too have thoughts on these questions. And so the format, our open roundtable format, will begin with a brief introduction from each panelist and then a series of questions. But we invite you, the audience, to jump in, ask questions. This includes students as well as faculty and the other panelists who will be joining us for the second roundtable to comment on the first.
So please feel free to join in and have like a flow with the event. Yes. So we'll now turn to our panelists. I'm going to introduce you super briefly and then have you talk, as we've discussed, a little bit about your own relationship to this topic in your project. So we have with us, we're not in the order of the sheets. This is Mary Kaufman, a postdoctoral fellow at Duke University. We're so glad to have you with us. Karen Brodkin, a professor emerita of anthropology at UCLA.
Women's Studies.
And Women's Studies as well. Amy Carrillo-Rowe, who's an associate professor of rhetoric, communication studies, and director of COROI, the Project on the Rhetoric of Inquiry at the University of Iowa, where we're colleagues. Also, Matthew Garrett, an assistant professor of English here at Wesleyan University. And we're really happy to have with us Scott Morgenson, assistant professor of gender studies at Queen's University. Do you mind kind of flowing in this direction? Scott, are you comfortable starting?
Oh, sure.
That would be fabulous.
I was last semester, so I was prepared for the day. I'll go first.
Excellent.
Thank you so much to Naomi and Margot and everyone who made this event possible. It's really thrilling to be here with you. We're just going to speak for about 2 to 5 minutes, I think, introducing ourselves and possibly the relationship of our work to the project we're involved in together. I have a broad background in feminist and queer studies with degrees in women's studies and anthropology. And for quite some time, I have been interested in providing an anti-racist and anti-colonial critique of queer politics in the United States and more broadly in its various globalizations. In fact, my work specifically argues that white supremacist settler colonialism conditions the historical formation of what we call sexual and gender minority politics on stolen land. And while this argument was cued for me by the histories of the effectively colonial appropriation of the histories, that's kind of a tautological statement, while this history was cued to me by recognition of histories of appropriation of the lives and experiences of two-spirited Native Americans by a normatively white and non-native LGBT queer movement. Looking at that for quite a long time and sort of dissecting how anthropology had been complicit in that history led me to a greater recognition of of settler colonialism as not just a historical but an active power relationship that is conditioning all people's lives on this land, and also conditioning how queer people identify themselves and organize their activism. So for me, the relationship between academic inquiry and participation in activist movements has always been quite intimate, complicating of my own subjectivity, my own sense of who I am and what kind of work I'm supposed to be doing in the world. As a result, it's also positioned me as a white settler critic of settler colonialism in forms of a accountable relationship to indigenous people, not just to indigenous GLBTQ and two-spirited people, but to the nations that indigenous two-spirit people belong to and are working together in projects of decolonization, national and transnational. And so as a result of that, I think very deeply about what the politics of alliance would be for white non-natives on this land. I also think in the context of queer organizing, how there's been a kind of a utopian gesture towards a multiracial and transnational queer politics, that whether it is participating in forms of state multiculturalism that are promoted by white settler states like the United States and Canada, or whether it's imagining itself as multiracial and global in the sense of collecting the cultural differences of sexuality and gender around the world in order to produce this idea of a global movement. I think of both of these as effectively causing people across lines of race, culture, and national identity to participate in processes of settler colonialism from very different social locations. And it's been one of the challenges for me as a white participant in those processes to try to work with other non-native people, people of color, white people on this land, to think about how we're differently positioned in relationship to native nations on this question, and how we can think together to construct effective politics of alliance. So I'll end by saying that that's where my work is moving. I'll probably be writing in this project about how my historical connection now as a scholar, and I guess you could say as an allied activist with indigenous HIV/AIDS activists who have played such an important role in the history of two-spirit organizing and in the critique of racial and colonial legacies in queer activism. I'm continuing to work with them by thinking very critically about how the fact and the idea of the pandemic have also been produced by histories of settler colonialism that are I call them histories because they are, but that are quite active in the present moment. Because I think that what we're seeing today is the mobilization of both state and global health regimes that have the stated intention of saving lives, but work in a biopolitical sense by making some lives and creating death for others, creating what Giorgio Agamben would describe as a state of exception in which some lives are more livable than others. And I think that the history of settler colonialism actually is active in this process because of the ways in which global health regimes understand their work to be one that could be related to histories of occupation, of assimilation or amalgamation, and of the permission for some people's lives to be eliminated. So that's all in there. Thank you. I talked more than 5, didn't I? Thank you, Naomi. You get us rolling and then...
Well, I will try to talk for fewer than 5 minutes, in part because I'm a literary critic, so I imagine I can be very verbose when it comes to questions of self-reflection. But I come to this question of academia and activism in part as a literary critic, with I think a much more kind of mediated relationship to the activist aspect of things than what Scott just presented. In part because it's difficult for work in literary history to speak directly, in my literary history, 18th century literary history, to speak directly to any kind of pressing activist question. Nevertheless, I have political commitments that draw me to a certain kind of work and a certain kind of activism. But I am a literary critic, so when I'm thinking about a word, I immediately go to history and try to think about the sort of conceptual terrain. And so as I was considering what I'd say today, I looked at the OED's definition of activism and activist to learn that activism and activist arrived together in English in the use that we're putting them toward today around 1920. And specifically, the OED gives an Atlantic Monthly article on the rising tide in Japan as the first use of activism to mean what we mean today, which is to say active participation or engagement in a particular sphere of activity, specifically the use of vigorous campaigning to bring about political or social change. And the line is this: above these people, which is to say above the sort of the proletariat in Japan, is the brain proletariat. Restless, alert, dissatisfied, repressed. The thought of this brain proletariat has many aspects, from Buddhist pacifism to Bolshevist activism. And it struck me that this is precisely the kind of predicament that we're engaging with today, which is to say intellectuals who have a kind of relationship to activism, but a kind of fraught relationship to activism. The paper that I'm writing for the special issue and most of my comments today are organized around this question, around the sort of ethical position of the intellectual vis-a-vis activism. I too, like Naomi and Margot, have a kind of suspicion of the political claims that I and others make in and through our work as we sort of refract our politics into the scholarly material, and then vice versa, refract the scholarship through the activist questions. And my paper is really a response to a question Margot and Naomi raised about the romance that academics may have with real politics, with real activism. And the paper deals with my position as what I imagine to be a kind of radical scholar, and also someone who's tried in various ways to engage in activism through an organization that tries to organize rank and file workers to democratize their unions and be more effective in their struggles in the workplace. What I found is that I was not accepted by this organization as a very useful intellectual, and that they didn't prove particularly useful to me in my thinking more generally about scholarship. Nevertheless, I remain committed to both sides of the question. So really, for me, this is the issue, as I said, is about the ethics of the activist scholar and the academic activist, as we try to think through our desire. Our desire and the romance we might have with the real thing.
Mm-hmm. Good morning. Welcome. It's so nice that you all came out so early this morning. So thank you for being here. Let me just tell you a little bit about the genealogies of my work that bring me to this question. I come to academia as a third world feminist scholar, so I study in the vein of folks like Audre Lorde and Gloria Anzaldúa and queer women of color who I consider to be very much activists. So in that line, in that vein of my trajectory, I'm actually interested in how we have this idea about the boundary between activism and academia. And that kind of brings my my other genealogies as someone who's trained in rhetoric, where questions of audience and like how to move audiences, how to, in the Aristotelian sense, like it's the art of moving souls. Like how does one craft one's message in such a way that it might be moving to people? And cultural studies, in sort of the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies, where folks like Stuart Hall were banned by the Thatcher government and blacklisted, and so certainly a lot of political activity. Antonio Gramsci was imprisoned by the fascist regime. So there are ways in which certain intellectual projects can become dangerous. And so when can they do that? And Antonio Gramsci's idea was the idea of the organic intellectual, or some people call folks public intellectuals. We have like Cornel West and Bell Hooks, and I'd say Gloria is a person like that. Like, how do people craft messages in such a way that they extend beyond, talking to the 30 of us in this room, which is a great place to talk, and maybe it is the 30 of us or the 50 of us and however many of us in this room writing. I feel like my writing has mainly been directed at other sort of progressive academics, and I'm beginning to question where, raising questions of audience, like how far could a queer women of color political project expand and touch people? My current project that I want to write for this special issue in this conversation is about queer Chicana performance. And I noticed that as somebody who's been studying queer Chicana performance, the work of Shri Moraga and one of her students, Adelina Anthony, who's just an incredible performer and intellectual. I would call her for certain. Both of them are organic intellectuals and very uncompromising in terms of they're seeking to intervene in Chicano communities. Like their work is targeted at Chicanos, and you're sitting in the audience, largely Chicanos, and then maybe like a few white folks and a few black folks, and most everybody will be a queer person, and a lot of working class folks. So I find myself, as I'm working with their work, like how do I bridge what work they're doing and to whom? And so then it raises the question of the rhetorical question, or like how do I write, and in what voice, and for whom am I writing? So I come to us today with a lot of questions, and I feel like even kind of at a crossroads between like a sort of academically trained, theoretical voice, but also somebody who's been immersed in the poetics of U.S. Third World feminism. So I find my writing spanning between those voices, and what's next? I'm excited to be with you all and think and feel and intuit our ways into what possible futures might come out of thinking about the synergies and disparities between academia and activism.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I'm particularly delighted to have this conversation across like the social science type orientations and literary questions of writing and communicating. I think are really important to me. I write about activism for the most part, but there are really kind of two moves that I write about. One of them, I guess you can call speaking truth to power or talking back. And so the book that I wrote, How Jews Became White Folks, and what that says about race in America, is probably my best talkback book. But lately I've always written. What do I do? What I want to do is to study social movements, and I want to do pondering questions. Okay, I used to organize, and if you've ever organized, you don't have time for those pondering questions. You have one question: what does it take to win? And particularly as I've aged out of day-to-day organizing, it's less exciting to me. I've been taking up pondering questions. So the first book, which was in my more active days, it was a feminist question. It was the early days of women's studies, and I wanted to know how women lead. There was a dialogue in the left at the time. Women don't. They're not interested, especially in the workplace. And every woman I knew that was baloney. And so I set out, wound up actually at Duke, writing about a civil rights hospital organizing drive. It was extremely powerful, long duration. And what I wound up doing was describing the ways that women lead from the ground up, and the invisible skills of so-called unskilled women's labor. So the contribution there, I think, is to try to make visible the power and the potential that we have. And I've done two more recent books that I'll talk about later about activism in Los Angeles. But the other part is the writing style. As a young scholar, I felt somewhat constrained about telling a story in a way that would have an impact. Scholarly committees often don't look favorably on that. You know, you have to have the genuflection to your intellectual language. But I don't have to worry about that anymore. Once you get tenure, worry about it. So I started trying to craft stories. And the goal of that is really to reach an audience of the unconverted. I can talk to I can hobnob with y'all, and we can crack syllables, and we know what we're talking about. But what I wanted to do was to reach college students, who are probably the largest audience in the aggregate of the kinds of books that public intellectuals and scholars both write. And I knew that there were a lot of lefty scholars out there who were looking for well-written books that they could use to do some work in their class in however way they saw it. So I began crafting stories and being more attentive to that, as well as attentive to the pondering questions that activists, that I engaged in with activists and then tried to put it together. Mm-hmm. So that's what I do.
Hi, I'm also very happy to be here, and I want to apologize in advance for any coughing fits or nose blowing I might have to engage in. I have a very bad cold. I have spent, I think, probably more of my life so far in activism than in academia. In fact, I've been here once before, then in my capacity as an activist for an organization in Durham several years ago. I will speak to that for a moment first. That project, which is what I'm most currently involved in, is an organization called El Quilombo in Durham, North Carolina, which is some sort of a mixture of a research collective and a community center and an evolving political project at the same time. And started from a group of students and migrants and other community members that saw sort of a necessity to start addressing problems in common, problems that for some people were very real issues of poverty and papers or lack of papers, and for others was what we consider to be the poverty of our academic and activist lives. Mm-hmm. And what we sort of came to together was that it wasn't that we didn't see it so much as a problem of separation or conjuncture between activism and academia, but of problems and practices internal to both. That I'll try to speak to more later, but that generally we felt tended toward an extraction from the common processes of knowledge production and organization, and toward the sort of formalization and individualization of professional identities, both for activists and academics. And that extraction from the common processes sort of provided a distance from the processes of the creation of subjectivities and struggle, which is what we thought both knowledge production and organization should do. So what we've tried to do, I guess, is build new practices of both, focusing on the common or collective process of both of those things that work together, viewing knowledge production as one of many practices that belongs within a movement, but also always trying to put a lot of emphasis on the power of the creation of concepts, and then the importance of the connection of that creation of concepts to other social practices, and trying to create sort of a collective cycle for doing that.
So our first question that we thought would be exciting to consider has to do with this question of how or when is activist labor intellectual, and when is intellectual labor activist, and when are they not? So we've already kind of started to get into that with the question of the organic intellectual, whether that figure exists or the extent to which that figure is a romance, and some of the questions, Karen, you raised around genre and students, like undergraduate students as consumers and readers of activism, which means that there's like a necessary marketplace as well, which is an interesting question around like the extent to which the context of capitalism can serve as like fomenting activism, right? So how and when is activist labor intellectual, and when is intellectual labor activist or not? And are there other terms we can use to describe either scholarship or activism? Like what other terms come to us, like so that we can maybe try to get ourselves out of that dichotomy? And we're just interested in understanding the links and gaps between academia and activism without either collapsing them together or saying, no, they're totally separate. So I don't know if anyone would like to start, and we do invite questions as we go along. We're not necessarily waiting for the end for questions, so if people want to jump in, again, please feel free to do so and tell stories about their own experiences as well as more critical theoretical observations. Who wants to start?
I'm looking at you, Amy, because I feel like you should. Because I feel like I want to say what you're going to say, so I want you to say it.
Let's see. Is this how is activist labor intellectual, and when is intellectual labor activist? Oh, it's the first cluster of questions.
Yes.
Okay. Now, on my little thing, I broke them all apart. Because I'm like, well, how is it? And I think I would just be repeating myself a little bit, but I see that intellectual labor is activist in the sense that we have a tremendous opportunity to intervene in what counts as knowledge. I mean, we have a lot of privilege and power. So then the question is what do we as academics who are invested in social justice do to use that voice and that platform to change ideas? And certainly my ideas have been changed. Like, I'm a product of that changing. I didn't come into college all radical. I mean, I was raised in Southern California to be heterosexual and white through like a sort of processes of assimilation and colonization. Like, I've since learned about like the ways in which the land was taken from my Mexican ancestors, and like that identity was fully denied. And I've learned that being queer is like a perfectly cool and dynamic way of living in the world and creating relationships differently. So I guess from my own experience as somebody who in the student seat has been transformed and kind of radicalized, then I find myself kind of at the other end of that dynamic, but also still very much in process, not like a completed activist or intellectual, but kind of always in process. So I think intellectual work is activist when it intervenes in dominant ideologies, and that happens through pedagogy, it happens through our writing, it happens through the poetics of our work when we're able to like really kind of like move something or some people. And I think that intellectual work is not activist. I guess I kind of bump up against a certain ego work that gets involved in it. When it's about aggrandizing ourselves as intellectuals, or when it's not in service of the community, somehow it has to be. I love what Scott says about like holding himself accountable to indigenous people upon whose land that we're actually sitting, upon whose land that this building is resting. Like, how do we do that when it's been such an awful and continues to be there's so many horrific things that continue to happen, quote, in our name, as Janet Jacobson was writing in her piece. Is Janet here yet? Oh yes, it's so great to meet you. There's so much that happens in our name as Americans, or as white people, or as settlers. I guess I'm a little bit. I can't quite draw a line of when intellectual work is not activist, but I feel like it tips into ego and career building and appropriation. And it tips into, I think unwittingly, like as Dylan's work beautifully points out, unwittingly supporting the very structures that we should be fighting against. Like in Dylan's work, he's working on the prison industrial complex and how intellectual labor and the academy are bound up. And I'm so excited for the expanse of layers of the complicity of academia with various forces of imperialism that we would hope that we were beyond and outside of, but maybe part of the intellectual labor is being in that uncomfortable place of we're complicit. We're not outside of and standing in critique of. We're critiquing from within.
Karen, you looked like you were going to say something earlier.
Yeah, I had a thought. I mean, when you were talking about learning and changing, it seems to. I tend to think of intellectual labor as labor that involves one in being changed and then having a responsibility to relate to others in ways of not, you're going to change this way, but rather trying to reproduce some of that dialogue and some of the history by which we were changed and continue to be changed. To spread that conversation, I think of that as extraordinarily important intellectual work. It doesn't only happen in the academy. It most assuredly happens in a whole range of domains. But it's not all progressive, as you pointed out. And it's not always unwittingly regressive. The academy is a very strange place in that it is a wonderful. If you're going to struggle intellectually, it's a good place to be. It's a whole lot better place than to try it in a corporation. And I think we should take advantage of that because it brings people together with at least the mottos and missions and trappings of we're going to grow. And so there is kind of a tacit agenda that I think left progressive intellectuals and activists should be taking advantage of a lot.
Question?
Yeah, please.
I wanted to jump in on what you were saying, Karen, because I've been thinking about a lot lately how difficult it is to separate this relationship from the institutions that confine it. And one of the things I've been thinking about are the ways in which certainly places like this one seek to contain activism, commodify it, and market it. And to the extent that intellectual work is truly radical or transformative, to try and hide that in layers of other stuff. So that one of the big things that a school like this one, and not only this one, does nowadays is funnel students into various kinds of teaching. Well, education is an essentially very conservative project in America today. So we take students who have a very activist sensibility and we cycle them into these projects that are very conservative. And then we package that up and put it on the website and say, gee, if you come to this university, you can do this fun activist thing. And what's often very interesting, if you talk to students who are involved in these things, is they actually get it. This is not activism, and that it's something else, but they don't really know what to call it either. And so one of the things I do think we need to think of in this relationship is to what extent are institutions sort of monitoring, packaging, naming, and putting it in the way of real transformation.
Are there students who want to share their experiences around this? Either any thoughts about authenticity and the feeling of authentic activism, or the commodification, packaging, and selling of activism?
Are any students doing that project of teaching? Are you doing it? You're giggling back there. Is it hitting home? Is there anything you'd want to share? I think there's coffee.
Awake is good. There's coffee in the other room.
I would just add to what Claire said in relation to teaching. Service learning.
Oh, yeah.
Well, No, they certainly hear and very well. There's this the kind of enormous institutional commitment to service learning, in which seems to be a kind of replacement for activism and to be founded on assumptions similar to what I think Claire has in mind about teaching, that the kind of best and brightest, if you're really smart, you can go in and do things for other people. And I used to kind of think, well, when service learning first came on the scene, that in some way students would be politicized by those experiences because they would go beyond the campus, etc., and they'd learn about the world. But it seems increasingly, as I observe it, that it's just kind of confirms a certain view of how people in a particular position of privilege can kind of go out and do good for the rest of the world, without notions about mobilization as self-empowerment of those people there and position themselves as
No, actually, in a way I was going to point to you. So.
Oh, okay.
We don't all have to talk on every question.
No, I'm thrilled that this is the thread that's emerging, and I'll just like to contribute to it and see where else it goes with my contribution. And also thank you, Karen, for reminding us that we change. And the critical analysis I'm attempting to provide in my work is not the one that I had when I entered the university system. And it was as a result of being radicalized and incredibly intellectually engaged, as well as a space, as well as a space that was engaged in activism, that I could become the person that you're meeting right now. But I do think that the second part of this question, the second question in this list, might be helpful to keep deepening the conversation, because we've been asked, how is activist labor intellectual and when is intellectual labor activist? And then we're asked, are there other terms we can use to describe scholarship or activism? I don't know if I can think of any other terms I would use to describe scholarship or activism, but I do think that when it became apparent to me that colonization contextualizes both scholarship and activism, that I became a different kind of thinker and actor in the world as an academic or as an activist. It doesn't necessarily break the sense that there's a binary between those two things, but there's something, and we're talking about the carceral state, we're talking about neoliberalism today, we're talking about settler colonialism, we're talking about deeply historically entrenched power relations that are both institutional and discursive, that have created a metaphysics that we're all thinking in context of, that we don't necessarily critique on a daily basis, and they might be conditioning both academia and activism and the sense that they exist in a binary relationship to one another. So I don't know, I'll just toss that out there and let it continue to flow.
Or that they don't, but that they exist in some kind of mutually supportive relationship. And so my question, actually, the reason I was going to point to it was because of your word, accountability. Or maybe it wasn't your word, maybe Amy pointed to Scott. So we're all pointing at each other as I point to everybody else. But accountability, responsibility, and authenticity are three terms that we've used. And I wonder if that's a way of where the kind of mutual reinforcement of academia, or maybe not mutual, but academic reinforcement of itself vis-a-vis activism, presents a kind of bind or problem. Right? Not maybe that one that can't be resolved, but I wonder what the kind of resolution to that could be. I think, Karen, when you're talking about communication, right, that's the responsibility. That obviously seems to me to be to connect to with what Marianne's saying about actual mobilization of people. And empowerment of people. But there's a way that it seems to me that works to contain and confine as much as the idea of a split does, right? Because the kind of mutual reinforcement depends upon the idea of a split in the first place to some extent. So what would it mean to be consistent, right? To be accountable? Does the, you know,
probably not
probably not so wrestling.
Yeah. Right. So I like that comment because that seems, if I'm hearing you right, seems to be one of those places where it seems, and Claire, you're setting up that thread was lovely, how that academia and activism have become closely linked in a particular moment or practice, and then we look at it critically and we start to see that actually it's an expression of a certain kind of controlling power relationship.
I was just going to say I also appreciate that sort of that line of thinking. Because I think it does help us understand that we're not trying to distinguish between the two things and how they're helpful or not helpful to each other, but to practices within both, right? So that you can often have what look like those thriving cultures of activism or academia in ways that are channeled immediately and wholly into an already existing regime of accumulation, right? That doesn't have another impact or process that separates from that. And we probably all recognize how both of those processes are in both of those, and the identities that are formed in them are easily made marketable, and there's much pressure to figure out how to market those things, to market ideas, to market identities, to market, and again, equally in activism and academia, in a way that I would call it continually like pulls it away from the common processes where ideas and politics are created. So it seems that one of the sort of key question there would be then what helps us to distinguish between practices that are made marketable and channeled into that regime of accumulation and practices that aren't. And I think there's several things that are shared in the two realms that I would say is critique of the two realms, and I make the critique as a self-critique, right, as being internal to both of those and recognizing those problems, that you have both a sort of like high individualization of the processes, both in academic production and the formation of activist identities, that becomes sort of reduces politics to that of individual choice, or a sort of responsible consumer of sorts. Heavy dependence on philanthropic funding and backing, right? That for any of the actual problems or benefits of the relation, by pure time and energy required, tends to buff the radical edges off of anything or consume all of your all energies and inspiration that goes into that. Some people have already mentioned that sort of market colonization of both worlds. In academia, you learn how to make ideas marketable, right? And I think you do some of the same things in activism, because in the desire for media attention or for resonance and trying to figure out how to sell an idea as much as a politics. What sometimes becomes hyper-pragmatism, which is an easy tendency in both things too. In activism, I think it becomes an over-focus on tactic, right, that loses relation or continuity to a continual analysis or strategic thinking, and in academia becomes a hyper-pragmatism that becomes a sort of form of sophisticated disbelief in radical possibilities, and that those two things become actually mutually complicit, right, and fuel lots of activity that doesn't necessarily advance in a particular direction. And all of that to say that it becomes, you develop a whole series of mind-killing practices in both realms, because activism that's not closely tied to thinking and analysis, not necessarily from within academia, but in general, becomes incredibly tedious. Like lots of tactics. Anyone who's been involved in activism knows that becomes incredibly tedious, right? And that academia without or thought production without a close relation to what's possible or action in and of the world can also become dreary, right? And that then I would just finally say that then those two things can become either sort of mutually compatible and complicit in that sort of marketable production of ideas and identities, or mutually distrustful in polarized visions of sort of an activist anti-intellectualism, or what would be the other side of that? Sort of that systematic production of disbelief in change from the side of academia.
Go ahead.
I wanted to follow on that last phrase, the production of disbelief. I find myself recently feeling like I want to be a strategic optimist, and being very aware also, after 40 years in the academy, of all of the ways in which it operates as a soul-sucking institution. It's, well, you've got fewer years and you're experiencing it. So I'm
You can see it.
So it just reminds me that there's, in a sense, partly the reason for this workshop is to remind us that intellectual labor is necessarily social labor and collaborative labor. And one of the things, I mean, as I was listening to the kinds of things that we experience daily that are destructive, the only or the most reliable antidote to that is conscious collaboration with others in the same ditch, line of work, and also sharing that sensibility, critical sensibility, in teaching, in writing, and having been involved also in service learning. And it is a never-ending struggle to change it into a kind of heightened awareness and social justice direction instead of a feel-good, do-good kind of operation, as you put it so beautifully. And the only thing, I think, that keeps one from sinking into cynicism is a little a panelina, a little network that amplifies those ideas and heightens it.
Thanks, Mara, when you're talking about the packaging of activism and being an intellectual into like the individual hero person, it actually makes me think critically about our next question, which is, do you identify as an activist or an academic? So, I mean, I am interested, and this is a question, again, that's open to the audience, like, do you identify as an activist, and what goes into that identity, and what counts as an authentic activist? But then stepping back from our individual stories so that we can think critically about the production of those categories across various kinds of sites, and whom they serve, and who they do not.
I also wanted to sort of, given what Matt said when you began this sort of separation of mental and manual labor, and sort of think about the materiality of this, the material reality that gives rise to this kind of binary in the first place, I wonder if, for Gramsci or for Marx, this was even a valid distinction, intellectual versus activist labor. And the notion of praxis and the work of, radical pedagogy, action and reflection. I think a lot of it depends on how you define knowledge, as Amy and you were saying. What is knowledge? And we've had so many feminist interventions into that, precisely of the kinds that you've been talking about. And I think not just service learning, but we have this thing at this university of how to evaluate non-traditional scholarship. We have people here who do radio shows, who write blogs, who do performance-based work as a way of communicating certain messages, taking up certain really important political activist issues. But by even labeling it non-traditional scholarship, or what do we do with this, it sort of reiterates and reifies that kind of binary, that you either do one kind of work or another kind of work. And it denies the basic collaborativeness of thought, of knowledge production, which you were speaking about. So, and it's a divide that I'm tired of reifying and just want to sort of, not do it anymore. To even call it A or B.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, actually, I want to follow up a little bit on what you said. There's Raymond Williams developed a term that kind of addresses some of the tension that we've been trying to articulate. That was an extension of the concept of hegemony. It's a really important term, which is incorporation, which is when a sophisticated or complex hegemony is able to incorporate countercultures and then reinforce the hegemony by saying, look, we're free speech, and free this, free that, and we will tolerate you, we might be a little bit upset, but we're going to tolerate you. that can in some ways threaten Jamie, but he also said that in thinking about the Jamie's never total, and by extension, incorporation is never total. And he also viewed incorporation as an opportunity to intervene, to use the stuff that dominant forces would co-opt, let's say universities, and then and use that as a kind of open door. And it seems to me that you, Amy, have said that, well, you're experiencing the academy, well, thinking about, let's say, the transformation of the production of knowledge in the academy from, let's say, the kind of the final years of the Vietnam War to the present. The categories of knowledge production have shifted. Not well, they've multiplied in various ways. And there's been a very important kind of expansion in what might be construed as a kind of activist or political or ethical production of knowledge. And it seems to me that we've got a lot of opportunities, rather than just kind of lapsing into kind of cynicism where we're looking at the kind of the service learning or the way universities market what might be represented as activism. Maybe that's an opportunity to go in and use that and actually turn it into what we want to turn it into. And in relation to that, it's interesting because what you were getting at too is activism. A good organizer and a good teacher, they're both interested in analysis and they're both interested in persuasion. And there is a link between that and marketing and the kind of, again, the term that Stuart Hall used a lot is hegemony. How do you change common sense? How can we? There's a common project between intellectual work and activist work, which is persuasion and it's analysis. And I guess the idea I want to put on the table is that we're thinking about what are the possibilities now, but there are long histories of activism in academia that could be recovered. And I think maybe one of the things we should think about doing is almost writing something like how-to books, how it was done in circumstances, certain circumstances, and what we might learn from that now. And if we look at the various disciplines, there are histories within those disciplines that might kind of inform what we can do in 2011. So there.
Thanks. Yes, Claire.
Okay. I think listening to the different ways people are trying to look at this binary of intellectual and activist that you suggested in that question makes me think of the ways in which certain kinds of privacy are complicit in maintaining that binary, and specifically the privacy of the classroom. And when I think about some of the most activist moments in which students have in fact generated that activism around certain kinds of issues that were important to all of us, I think of the ways we have consciously violated that privacy of the classroom, and that those have produced moments in which I did not feel as though I was moving from one position to the other, but in which the two became temporarily harmonious with each other. One was when students who had been to the AFL-CIO's Union Summer came back to campus and became part of the Justice for Janitors campaign. During the course of that campaign, they launched it by taking over the admissions office on the day that the acceptance letters went out, and they occupied it. And my class, which had one of the organizers in it, went to the admissions office to hold our seminar that week because she couldn't leave because she was occupying. And so we had our class in the middle of the occupation. And I would say two things really stand out for me. One was people joined us throughout the course of the 3 hours. So that at one point, one of the administrative assistants said, all of you care so much about the janitors, but nobody cares about my work conditions. And I said, well, would you please join us and talk to us about your work conditions? And then some of the other administrative assistants dropped in for 45 minutes and they left. Parents came and went, parents who were visiting, other students came and went. And that was sort of one of those moments in which I imagined what a classroom would look like if you invited strangers into it to contribute what they had to offer. Similarly, and I'll make this brief, students organized as part of the Books Not Bombs campaign and asked faculty to hold open classes for that day, in which any student could go to any of the classes that were open to them in that day. And, you know, those strike me as important moments to come back to and say, okay, under these conditions, how did intellectual work and activism come together to produce something entirely new and different that was transformative, if not forever, for that moment?
Can you say more about the transformative part, Claire? I mean, because part of it sounds like a kind of experiential thing, the kind of the opening of the classroom into the kind of public sphere. And I was thinking in part, it depends on the class, right? So I mean, when I'm teaching a course on early American literature, I could certainly make the scene for that kind of thing, but it's a little bit different, like because the questions are so mediated. Right?
Yeah, I think the question would be, how much is your authority as the professor of that class pinned to actually doing what was on the syllabus for that day? I mean, one of the things I was able to do, because it was a class on the New Deal, right? We were supposed to read Robin Kelly's Hammer and Hoe for 2 weeks hence, and I wrote them all 2 nights before and said, scratch the book for Wednesday, we're moving Hammer and Hoe up, and this is where we're going to meet. But I think moments of giving up the authority and giving up the plan and the syllabus actually are transformative for me as a pedagogue. I think they can also be transformative for students because you're not saying what we're doing in this class is not important. You're saying it's important in a different way. And in order to do that, we have to be flexible and we have to shift our priorities temporarily and see what that looks like and take that risk and see what happens.
You had your hand up over there. Yeah.
I was just going to say that from a student's perspective, this idea of non-traditional scholarship. I mean, I can only speak about here. I wasn't, but I actually briefly brought this up in Professor Potter's class yesterday. Hannah and I were in a service learning prison outreach class last semester, and it was unlike anything that I've taken at Wesleyan, but it was at times hard for a couple different reasons. This, I guess, isn't that important, but just in terms of how people our age would receive it, I think that people kind of had this attitude of, oh, it's cool that you're doing that, but you're taking that as a class. Just this idea of it being non-traditional and kind of going out once a week and sitting in this prison for a few hours and working with these men. It was, I think, hard for people to understand that in the context of things that are usually run by textbooks and syllabi and things like that. And for the students, for us in the beginning of the class, there was no week-by-week breakdown of the syllabus. There were no formal textbooks. The papers were. It was very much just we're going to throw ourselves in there and do it. And as students used to a traditional classroom, it was really overwhelming at first. But in the end, I mean, it was a class that didn't really spend much time in the classroom, but it had the most effect on me from I think any class that I took over the semester, and I was continually thinking about it outside of the class. So, I mean, in that sense, it was some of the best scholarship that I was having throughout the semester.
It's an interesting story too, in terms of the reference I made to Dylan's work earlier. If the classroom shares a history with the history of incarceration in the prison, but then your experience of having a prison as a classroom becomes liberating, then we begin to get in a very complicated situation. Does anyone else want to share stories either about service learning or when the classroom feels radicalized to you or not, or pseudo-radicalized? Or maybe we can return to the question too of, do you identify as an activist or as an academic or both or neither? And then how do those terms, emerge through various kinds of histories and ways that we can critique and at the same time that we embody them? How do you negotiate potentially competing demands of intellectual and activist labor? And how and when is academia useful to or complementary to activism, and what are the obstacles that can keep activism and academic work from meaningful dialogue or mutual intervention? So this is, again, an open question to our panelists and others. Various kinds of identifications, and you did have your hand up, so I'm open to your question. I just wanted to keep things going too.
There was one moment years ago in my American Studies students when students came to a boil and they said, look, we really complicated our sense of own to see what we're connected to our life and all that stuff. But now what do we do about it? Mm-hmm. And I said, well, you're changing your thinking about the world. If you mean something more concrete, like what can you actually graduate from Wesleyan, what can you actually do about it in terms of what jobs could you get, what things could you apply for, what's available to you out there, what kind of organizations exist, what kind of possibilities are there. You want me as a professor who's not just teaching you social critique to actually supply that information? You want me to do that? And they said yes. And then, so then I had to try to build a new knowledge base in addition to American Studies, thinking about, okay, so if you've been radicalized, what is out there? And so I began having conversations with career services and getting in touch with people who were kind of activists and sometimes inviting them into my classroom. But it wasn't, that's a whole other thing that showed me the limitations of what I was doing. But it was one of those moments where they went, okay, now you've convinced us, you've persuaded us, but now what do we do? So could we do more along those lines if we're interested in being radical pedagogues?
Sure. I wanted to follow up on your point, Claire.
Yeah.
Claire. You had a phrase that sort of blew me away. The authority of the classroom is limited to sticking to the syllabus. And I think that's very powerful. It goes nicely with the point Purnima was making. Unless students or a social movement jars us or is creating the conditions, we don't even think about that. So I wanted to add to your story another one that goes back many decades to 1969 or 70 when I was a new faculty person. And that was a very different era. Jeff said this is not a good era for a lot of latitude. That was a good era for a lot of latitude. And I was teaching an introductory anthropology class, and I said, I want you to do a paper or a project that introduces concepts from the classroom and brings them together with everyday life. It was a time when women were returning to college, and they were referred to in very derogatory ways by male faculty and the administrators. And they were young women, they had kids, and there was no child care center. I was in the same boat. So three of them got together and said, we want to get a child care center on campus. This is a project. I said, good project. You need it. They went to the chancellor, and they said, we think this university needs a child care center. And he said, well, I think so too, but we're so short of funds. I mean, we can't just take it from Black Studies. And they said, oh yeah, you're right, we don't want to do that. And they came back and reported to me. I said, why didn't he say take it from chemistry?
Athletics.
Or his salary.
But they got it. They said, this is divide and conquer. And they really got teed off and organized. And they got a petition drive. They went through all sorts of things. And they deputized, the women faculty got involved because we were all having kids. And we went to, they deputized me to go to the campus maids and see if they would join in. And the maids said, look, our kids are grown. This is not our first demand. What we want is pay parity with janitors. And we said, ooh, what a great idea. We didn't know you didn't have it. So it wound up in being just an all-university seizure of the microphones from the chancellor, the same thing, and sit in the chancellor's office. And ultimately we did get a child care center. And it was a learning moment for me. It was a time when it was easy to defy the limited authority of the classroom and to open it up. And I've been very hesitant in subsequent years to do that. And your phrase just resonates with me, how we live in a fairly conventional prison of privatizing the classroom.
So since we don't want to talk about whether we identify as an activist or an academic, why don't we instead turn to this question that has reemerged in various contexts, which is knowledge is generated outside the academy. Purnima, you were saying, and you as well, Jeff, that the intellectual as a category emerges at multiple sites, and it's not as if, the whole point of this is that academia is not like the only place where the intellectual happens. So how or do knowledges generated outside of the academy expose, disrupt, or transform naturalized conditions of academic knowledge production? Should or can academics become more responsive and responsible to alternative bases for knowledge production, and how? And I don't want to put you too much on the spot, Scott, but I know that you and Mira have done a lot of work in these areas. I don't know if you want to talk a little about your own.
I was about to raise my hand.
Excellent. Go ahead.
Thank you for putting this question on there, and I'm really interested in it. I hope that y'all are as well. And we wrote little ditties about our work for one another before we came. That's how we know so much about one another's work. I just want to read a few passages from what I wrote. I'm reading from some work by Jeff Corntassel, who's a professor of Indigenous Governance at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. And in a recent blog in advance of the 2011 Canadian Congress for the Social Sciences and Humanities, it's the big national conference for social science and humanities people, Corntassel examines how Indigenous intellectuals work in relationship to what he calls insurgency. He calls it, quote, a state of rebellion or act of rising in revolt against established authority, by producing what he calls insurgent education as an important part of an anti-colonial struggle and of pedagogies of decolonization. And I found this passage to be incredibly powerful, moving, and challenging to me, because it reminded me of many of the projects that I've studied and the models of activist intellectual work by Indigenous critics. Noe Silva's work in Aloha Betrayed that demonstrates generations upon generations of Native Hawaiian resistance to American colonialism, many of which had been stamped down and erased by being either misarchived or not archived at all, and it was through that process of an intellectual archivist kind of relationship to histories of knowledge that she brought back that material. I recommend the book. Robert Warrior's work, I've learned so much on this point from Kealani Kauanui's work. For me, what this teaches me is that when the project is decolonization, the distinction between activism and academia, or intellectual labor and activist labor, it can potentially become specious. Like it can become almost another colonizing trick to prevent recognizing that one of the things that's under struggle here is the very conditions of knowledge production. Like everything from just the fact that we're speaking in the English language right now and all the history but that's sort of a utilitarian way of looking at it. But also I used the word metaphysics before, that there's also a way through which we happen to be using that language that we may or may not be fully disturbing. I'll just end on this thought that when my work with, I've been learning so much from Indigenous HIV/AIDS activists. As health activists, their work is so massively controlled by the health apparatus of the settler state. There's so much pressure to take federal funding to operate under governmental rules that are actually designed to contain and limit the possibilities for undoing how health has been like one of the key targets of settler colonialism. It's why we use the word genocide, to talk about that history. So one of the exciting things that I see going on in all across Indigenous health activism, people are doing, you don't need me to report it, people are clearly announcing on an agenda to transform both how we think about health as well as how we try to practice or produce health in the world. And that means bringing back and some that there are indigenous epistemologies and indigenous methodologies for understanding the body, land, relationships among people, and all of the political and social apparatuses that would come from that. If we were to follow, and I say this sometimes in my writing about indigenous HIV/AIDS activism, if you were to follow some of these arguments to their logical conclusion, right? So then not only would the naturalized conditions of academic knowledge production be exposed and destabilized, but we might not think that the best knowledge production is always going to happen. Not that we do think that, but we might think that it would not only be happening in an academic space, and we'd also be questioning about in what ways, and maybe not always, or not in every way, but in what ways did the academies that were produced by the settler society actually prevent these kinds of thinking, and so that other kinds of spaces for thinking else have to be produced, while simultaneously recognizing, like Korntassel says, that it's been precisely the effort of so many indigenous activists to go directly of people who are pursuing a project of critique to go directly into the academy to accomplish that critique. And that's why we have models like Silvers and Warren's work to speak to. I hope that's a useful thought. I mean, it brings up a lot of stuff for me, and I don't know that it's all clearly sorted out in my mind, so it would be nice to talk about it with people as well.
Yeah, I would say, also building from what Scott said, and then in response to some of the topics brought up earlier about what is students asking what they should do, and then the question of what is useful. Something that we worked on or thought about for a long time in Quilombo was how is intelligence produced, and having a sort of intuition and trying to build on the thought that intelligence is produced through collective engagement, right, through forms of interaction and common practices, right, not usually in isolation. And then also the question of what not just what is useful in activism or what is useful for activism, but what actually constitutes politics, right? What constitutes doing political action today, right? In the sense that it being important to figure out what that is, because so it doesn't gain distance from a contemporary reality, right? The same in the way that politics can become a repetition of tactics if it's not related to a continual analysis of what's going on. So. Several of the things that we tried was, okay, if we understand that both of these things, that intelligence is produced in collective engagement, that politics only happens in collective engagement, in settings of the common, and that if we think that current structures, and again, I don't mean in the abstract, I mean very concrete contemporary structures of the U.S. university system and a lot of the U.S. activist scene, it draws away from those common processes, right? And again, not in abstract in the way that they exist now, and not holistically either, but as a predominant tendency, then we would have to figure out ways to create those processes and spaces for those processes that encourage the production of our own collective intelligence, right? New ideas to be able to handle what we considered was our contemporary situation. And I think, so in doing that, then part of the thing, part of our project was, so what does constitute doing politics in the U.S. right now? What is it that needs to be done? Because I don't think that's necessarily obvious, right? And we can look at different aspects of it. You have a political system based primarily or mainly or predominantly on spectacle, right? A complete rupture of representation, massive social fragmentation, sort of an information overload that leads to sort of confusion and disorientation more than actual awareness for most people, or most of the population, including us. And all of those things create a source of, or a kind of isolation, and which was, affirming and disturbing, but also sort of like, okay, this is what we were able to do with even just a few common processes put into works. How do we go about creating those common spaces where that can happen, right? And that, can have relation to being within the university or traditional activist spaces, but I don't think that if we try to, I think we talked about earlier a little bit, move away from strictly terms of activism and academia and talk about knowledge production and political organization, those might happen in activism and academia, but I don't think there's any guarantee that they will, right? And that finding ways of understanding, if we understand that the contemporary moment pulls us out of common processes through the structures of academy, through the structures of U.S. society, then one political action is actually to find ways to create those spaces of encounter, basically, that can start to happen. That's what I have.
Maybe we can sort of, as we think about tying pieces together, return to this idea of the romance that some academics, many academics, may have with the political. So what do people think, like, when and why do academics position themselves or their scholarship as political? How do we assess the political potentials of scholarship and teaching? And I'm wondering, too, if there is a corollary to this question. I sort of am a little disappointed that if we think about traditional definitions of activism, the two most activist components of our project, the Feminist Ink Blog Collective and Matt Matilda, are not here. So we have some scholar activists, but we don't have anybody who identifies rather more on the activist side than the scholar side, although, of course, the chief of the editorial collective just finished her PhD in women's studies, and Matt Matilda has published in scholarly venues, so it's all very mixed and intertwined. But maybe we can talk about the romance and its relationship to the real, or, yeah.
I actually wanted to come back to the question of romance from a slightly different perspective, because I've been listening to various people in the room talk about desire, being moved, needing to move, how do we move audiences, how do we reach them. And it seems to me that then we, of course, don't really follow up on that, but we talk about intellectual labor or academic work versus activist work. But where exactly do we articulate a kind of passion in engagement and in politics, and is that part of the romance of it, and is it a necessary part? Is there an emotional kind of thread that we need to be exploring as well, and of course communicating in the classroom also, sometimes suppresses our feeling of freedom to express our commitments, at least for our passions. On the other hand, we're expected to be passionate about what we teach. And so there's a real problem we haven't worked through very well. Mm-hmm. Nice. I'd be interested in
Let's talk about desire and pleasure.
Mm-hmm. And punishment.
And punishment. Yeah.
And what was that? And what?
I come from a place where you're either for it or against it, and I'm for it. But I also, when you brought up the romance thing, I actually want to admit to it. I want to. And I think that maybe part of the reason that it's hard to admit to is for the point that Jeff made, and also one that Mara made, about fetishization, which is, to me, always tied to the commodity fetishization, and the ways in which the idea of studying activism can be detrimental to activist projects in particular ways, and can feed a romance that is not this kind of pleasurable, passionate engagement, but is one that fetishizes and produces a product that is alienating to the projects themselves. But in terms of the romance, I mean, I grew up in Iowa City, Iowa, as some of you know, in the 1960s, and it was in its own way a barren existence. Think of all this snow with a lot of wind and no culture. And the students who were involved in really serious, actual social movement. I mean, it wasn't just activism. I was utterly fascinated with them. They opened the idea that there was a broader world. I mean, they literally, in one way, saved my life and raised up possibilities that were just not available in the social world in which I lived, which was, in certain ways, not because of the university, but the educational system, educationally impoverished and just in other ways empty. And I think that communicating possibility and strategic or even perhaps reckless optimism is one of the things that activism can do. Part of what it is about is not even just we're changing the world around us, but life possibility, changing what the possibilities are that the people who participate have. So in that sense, a romance of activism, I think, is, not such a bad thing, or maybe, active sexual engagement. I have a colleague who works on union organizing and the role of queer politics in union organizing, which is often pushed away, and yet she says all of these meetings are all about people coming together and in fact having sexual engagement with each other. Like, they're really sexy meetings, and yet we won't talk about sexual engagement. So I think all of that can be really powerful, life affirming, and crucial to activist possibility, but also to just the possibility of life for participants.
I'm a great fan of romance. In a sense, it is opening yourself up to the possibility and entering a situation with an expectation that there's going to be something new and exciting. And I had the same reaction, the same emotional feeling that you described when I first became involved, way back in the early 60s when the civil rights movement was going on. And I can describe it. It was opening up my life to be part of a larger world than just sort of finding a personal happiness, which didn't quite hack it for life. And it was like a tremendous burden was lifted to be able to go forth and be part of something that had intrinsic meaning. And so I celebrate that. And I often get accused of being a romantic. And I embrace it. Tell me when I tipped overboard. I'm open to correction. But I want to hold on to that sensibility. And I think that people who have been involved, if you talk to any organizer, they'll tell you, what hooks people for life? They get involved in a campaign and they win. It changes them forever. They never go back. And it's that feeling of efficacy. Power is a funny word. It's a feeling of efficacy, participation, and collaboration that is extraordinarily liberating. And if we don't think about the structures of feeling and the transformation of identity, we're missing the boat. And if we don't think about dreaming big, we're missing the boat.
I guess one of the ways the turn to romance causes me to think about are the ways in which students come to college, often regardless of whether they've gone to good schools or bad schools, knowing that they have been poorly taught. And our failure to acknowledge this in our pedagogy, but rather to kind of build on the authority of the teacher-student relationship that students are bringing with them into college, I think is something that is worthy of major examination in terms of what an activist commitment as a pedagogue might look like. Because one of the things that I've seen over the years is that the activist commitment in the classroom can often, and I don't say this in a dismissive way, but it can often unconsciously move into a kind of cult of personality that is actually disempowering to students figuring out what they already know, and being asked once again to filter what they know through the figure of the teacher. And we don't really talk much about radical pedagogy nowadays, which is somewhat different from how you teach activism or how you might empower activism among your students. So I just want to throw that in, but I think when we think about romance, we have to think how that might be a collective romance, rather than a romance of student to teacher or teacher romanticizing the act of what they're doing with students.
Could I jump on?
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm really compelled by what you're saying, Claire, and it made me think a couple things. Like there was that book, "Lies My Teacher Told Me," that we might remember, right? And so right. So a normative secondary school and primary school education is just lies, and maybe sometimes that activist moment for a young person prior to, or if they're in a college university after they get into college university, is recognizing that was a kind of a betrayal, and then that betrayal sparks an emotional relationship to the desire to have different knowledge and to do different things. And I love that you also pointed out the danger of sort of a cult of personality around the activist and like Jules, or possibly Professor. Just that sense that that was connecting to something for me. I'll come back to it later, but no, it comes back for me to your example of the sit-in at the admissions office, because I don't know how to. I won't try to explain everything that happened there, but for me, it made me remember popular education. It made me remember all of the times, which have succeeded more or less well, that I've been at different schools where students and people who aren't actually enrolled at the school gather together to create effectively community-based, horizontal, and autonomous educational environments that aren't being held at the university, but they're called, there's the external college of the Twin Cities, was something that a lot of students at McAllister and other private colleges, as well as students at University of Minnesota, participated in, and classes were produced ad hoc. There was no money being exchanged. There was a kind of a community-based anarchist kind of relationship to knowledge production that was simultaneous for many of the students who were in one of these enrolled institutions, and it certainly changed their experiences. But to the extent that is like this little tiny little tip, this little thing that may or may not happen on the edge of someone's life, as opposed to like really bringing that back into the halls of the academy in the first place, that, I'd be more interested in seeing more of that.
I think there's real generational sort of questions around the romance as well. Just thinking about being in an age where people fantasize that we're in a post-race, post-feminist moment, and who's allowed to have a fantasy and who feels like the fantasy happened before they were born, and like it's sort of almost embarrassing to even believe in it in various kinds of ways. And this goes back to, Mira, what you were talking about, the radical production of disbelief that on the one hand feels more authentic to many of us, but on the other hand, like, I'm not sure. I don't know. Like, what's that foreclosing? So I think we can think about who's allowed to believe in or who monitors our beliefs and the relationship of pleasure to shame as well, if we think about psychic economies and desire around activism. And
romance is a funny thing, right? And desire is a funny thing too, in terms of this question, because I think Karen's thing about this would be, of course, you need the romance to have anything happen, right? No, people aren't going to do things if they're not romanticizing what could happen, right? If you don't have a sense of the possible, desirable future. But on the other hand, I think this is in a way where Naomi is tilting us, and even where Janet began, right? That can slide back into a kind of, and this is not Janet, but this is into a kind of solipsism about the what's getting done through pathos, right? Which is really what we're talking about. Okay, through an appeal to an audience, right? An emotional, affective appeal to an audience, which in a lot of academic work, and maybe more in my fields that I sort of run around in, history and literary criticism, than in others, like anthropology, although I'm not sure about that, may have a tendency to make it seem in a kind of classic sentimental structure, as though the work is getting done because you express the feeling, and because you then have the romance, then you've done the work, right? We here have sort of shifted in between sort of cold, hard assessments of the structure of the academy and so on and so forth, and our own commitments and our own experiences, and to find the line between those things, and to be kind of responsible and authentic as we shuttle between our personal desire and a kind of collective desire, which is, of course, necessary when we get something done, and a real analytical position that can take account of the political economy of the university and everything else, and also inspire us to do something in relation to that that's effective, which may be writing the right kind of sentence. But there are a lot of the right kind of sentences seem to have been written for a very long time. And it's not entirely clear what the relationship is between those sentences and the sentences we say and the work we would like to get done. And crucially, that kind of desirable future, which is a radical question in the sense that it's a foundational question. Right? I think when Anu pointed us back to Gramsci, and when Amy is talking about the organic intellectual, I mean, this, in a way, Gramsci didn't face quite the same question because he wasn't in prison because he was a great university professor who opened his classroom to the students, and the students came and said, "What should I join?" He was the head of the Communist Party in Italy, fascist time. So it's not, I mean, he could have gone on and become a professor instead of doing that. He went to the university after all. But by the time we're interested in him, really, he's already made these decisions, and we all in the room, one way or another, as students and teachers, have made the decision to identify as academics, not as activists, simply through our employment, right? Through our jobs, through our actual to use the academic term, our vocations. And these seem to be motivated by the romance, by the desire, right? In many ways, but in an uneven and uncertain way. So I think the desire and romance are funny things. It points in both directions.
Yeah, Dylan, were you going to share something?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things, maybe sort of different kind of political desire to study university for those of us who encounter the university as an inherently hostile site, who understand both in well-theorized ways and intuitive ways that the university does not exist there for you, that it's actually against you. That the very reason why it exists is to get rid of your existence as such. At its most generous points, it will reform you, render you a civil being. And it's another way of thinking about this term that came up at the early part of our discussion around this notion of non-traditional scholarship, which is obviously a euphemism. And what it hides is two things. One is the political possibilities inherent in anti-disciplinary intellectual work. Meaning scholarship is forms of intellectual production, but stuff that's anti-disciplinary. And of course, what that also means is it includes the ways in which the whole epistemic, pedagogical, and practical structure of academic disciplines are part of civilizational war, always have been. Which says to me that another way of maybe framing the position that students and others have with universities is to understand that the university has always understood itself as a primary site of war. Always. It's never not been that. And one of the ways in which it reproduces its role in training combatants, so to speak, is in convincing those of us who presumably fall within a liberal humanist agenda that it's a site of civility. Right? It's a site of scholarly exchange, sober and rational discourse. And the thing that the right understands very well is that it's a place where you train combatants. And the right understands very well that universities are places where you authorize some of the most reactionary and gruesome forms of social dominance, which in other historical moments would be unthinkable and unfeasible. Something that I always say in introducing the need and urgency to think about the centrality of the prison regime to shaping our everyday way of life is to say this is something that was beyond Goldwater and Nixon's wildest dreams. I mean, if you told them at the height of their success there'd be 2.5 million people locked up on the history of humankind, and half of them would be black, the majority would be black, brown, and native, they would have laughed at you. And what I'm getting at is that the university played a central role in that. Right? The university played a central role in rendering that feasible, normal, reproducible, and even good. So as far as I'm concerned, the place of desire and romance I come from is from that of an encounter with the university as what it is, as a site of hostility, of something beyond alienation is what I'm saying. Right? There's some sort of alienated, and then there's other ways. I teach at University of California, Riverside, where the majority of students I teach ethnic studies, the majority of students in my classroom understand the university as such, that they encounter the university as a place that is hostile to them. And I think one of the worst things I could do would be to train them into a civil kind of denomination and just teach them in a civil way how to navigate it. I don't. I say this place hates you. Right? This place is, what you're feeling is a low-intensity war against your very existence. You're not meant to be here. And it's in my sense of it, it's in no way a kind of cynical and disempowering gesture. I'm saying this is preparation for the kind of politics and intimacies and desires that I want to embrace. I'm not sure what that means. That's what scares the shit out of me. I try to cuss at least once per
Can I add to that? Because I think what I hear a lot of people saying implicitly, and you brought it up very well, Dylan, is this notion of the bureaucratization of everyday life and serious bureaucratization of these institutions, which are depersonalizing. It's all about being dispassionate, and you're sort of forced to embody certain kinds of authority and ways of showing it in order to have a job and continue at it. And even students have that sort of expectation from you in some ways, because they're also sort of that sort of bureaucratic rationality and how depersonalized. I'm sorry, I keep bringing up Faber again. He's very much in my mind as I'm listening to it, because that's kind of what everybody here has been talking about. And so the university itself becomes, and the politics of knowledge production and of being part of these sorts of institutions itself become a really important site of activism, I think. And my romance, I just wanted to say, part of what got me to sort of question this very divide is always wanting to be an activist, but being an academic, but being an anthropologist who studies activism and how that sort of fetishizes and reifies and, keeps my romance going. But how that has also sort of allowed me to precisely think about the processes of reflection and knowledge production that go on in activist circles. And also think about other ways in which those kinds of collaborative, knowledge production can happen, what role I can play, how do I, so that's kind of, that keeps my romance alive. And I think maybe that's also fetishizing of ethnography, but I do think that's been a really important tool for me. That's it.
I was trying to think through what Dylan said in the sense of thinking that one of the political tasks perhaps in the university is to ruin the romance. There's several sorts of romance, but one would be to ruin the romance that people have with the university and thinking that it's a neutral space, right? And that the choices there for many are either to become a subject compatible with the system or to be criminalized, right? And then to somehow, I don't know if it's possible in the same space, to create a passion for something else that would be not those two options. But it seems sort of trying to tie the two ideas of what Dylan talked about in the conversation about romance earlier, that you have to ruin a certain romance, that this is that it's that neutral space, right? That it's going to create all those possibilities for everyone, right? Recognize what it does create, and then there being a possibility of resisting both of those subjectivities, I guess, and creating some sort of passion or drive for something else in connection with others.
Thank you, Dylan, for your comment, and it's really stimulating my thinking. And I'm thinking about how it's nice to talk about romance in relationship to activism, because I guess my betrayal, to use the word I used before, wasn't just in finding out that what I'd been taught in the academy was a lie, but also that what I'd been taught in my own social movement was a lie. right? That in fact my own identity as a marginalized person was kind of a lie, actually. And so it was not to suggest that my marginalization doesn't take place, but if even my marginalization is conditioned on my participation in modes of oppression, right? Literally, I'm saying it that way. Even my experiences of marginalization are actually conditioned on, well, first being on this land, among other things. Then and it gets deeper than that. It's like it allows for my romance, to, if I have one, to be about, wanting to struggle. You know, I struggle maybe in a critically self-reflexive way, but I want to struggle with my kin. I want to struggle with my lovers. I want to struggle with the people to whom I belong. I don't want to think that my activism is about actually, you know what I mean? Like, this can get set up when you are someone who's struggling with one or many intersecting forms of oppression. The part of the romance is discovering the community where you're finally going to be taken care of and loved, and when you go there, you'll be safe or something. I don't know if that's always what happens to us, and differently positioned as we are in relationship to this question. But it was as it was for me. I'm excited when I'm pursuing what I experience is it's work, and I fail all the time to do white anti-racist work with white queer people, to do radically anti-colonial work to the extent that we can actually get to that place, because it's kind of jump a lot of barriers to even be able to conceptualize it coming from where I come from. To do radically anti-colonial work across racial and ethnic lines with queer people in non-native space, that's I find that to be totally life-affirming and exciting. If we can use the role of romance to describe that, then I would be okay with it. Other than that, I think that I had to get rid of a certain kind of romance with my own activism in order to even pursue the work that I think is the most important thing to do right now.
Sure. And one theme that I'm hearing emerging here too is kind of showing up even when romance is sour, and kind of being there, like exactly, like in the war zone every day. So romance and war, or anti-romance and war. I just want to thank everybody for being here, lending your energy and your voices to this first Roundtable panel, and I hope to see many of you this afternoon for our second one. And a round of applause for all of you and our amazing panelists.